The Giant King, written by Kathleen T. Pellet. Long ago in Scotland, there once lived a carpenter's son called Rabbie. Every day, Rabbie worked alongside his father, learning how to make tables and chests and cradles that rocked as smooth and gentle as a summer's breeze. Often, when the day's work was done, Rabbie would make his own carvings: swallows gliding with wings outstretched, a sheepdog, its face crumpled with sleep, or a baby snuggled in the crook of a mother's arm. And so lifelike were his carvings that some who saw them swore they could almost hear the rustle of wings or feel the cold, damp nuzzle of a dog. "However do you make such fine figures from a block of wood?" they'd ask. But Rabbie would only shrug. "They were in the wood all along," he'd say. "I discovered what was hiding there." Sometimes people would ask Rabbie to make a special carving for a son's birthday or a daughter's wedding, and they'd bring along a favorite dog or a soft purring kitten. "Can you make a carving of this?" they'd ask. Rabbie would bend down and run his hand along the creature's back, stroking and patting and kneading. He'd press his face against the animal's mouth and breathe in, one long, deep breath after another. Finally, he would set to work, whittling and chiseling until the carving was finished. "It's grand, Rabbie," some would say, while others would gasp and cry. "But it's too grand to be our dog Nell. You can't see the gash on her leg or the lump in her ear. Why do you make things better than they really are?" But Rabbie would only smile. "You see with your eyes," he'd explain, "and so you see what is. But I carve with my heart, and so I see what can be, what might be." "The lad's a bit of a dreamer," the carpenter would say with a sigh, and the people would nod and smile. But still, they paid Rabbie well and hurried off home, clutching their carvings close like a promise. As the years passed, Rabbie traveled to other towns and villages, making carvings for wealthy merchants and important lords. Now, it happened that one day, while he was staying in a far-off town where the king himself lived, Rabbie saw a great commotion there. Crowds of people scurried to and fro in a terrible froth of confusion as a mighty giant thundered through the marketplace. Roaring and bellowing, the giant capsized stalls, toppled tables, and smashed crates of fruits and barrels of grain. Some of the people huddled together, white-faced and trembling, while others ran after the giant, shaking their fists. Some even picked up cabbages and hurled them at the giant's leg. "Get back to your cave, you beast!" they shouted. Oh no, they don't like that the giant came to their town. With one blood-curdling roar, the giant heaved 2 crates of turnips onto his shoulders and lumbered out of the marketplace, crashing down the path that led the mountain called Ben Cullen. "Who is that man?" asked Rabbie, turning to a group of townspeople at his side. "He's not a man," growled the innkeeper. "He's a monster." "His name is Duncan McKinnon," said the innkeeper's wife. "He came here nearly a year ago, wanting to make his home here in our town." "Imagine, a giant living with decent folk like us." "We ran him out of town," added one of the merchants. "But now he lives in a cave in Ben Cullen. Every day he comes down here to steal our food and frighten our wee bairns." "Aye, no one can get rid of him," said the innkeeper. "But surely he only behaves like this because we treat him this way," said Rabbie. "If you were to treat him like a king, then he would act like a king." An angry mutter rumbled through the crowd. Treat him like a king? What foolishness, they scoffed. What do you guys think?
I think they should treat him like a king. So do I.
It's worth trying, right?
Yeah.
Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
But there were some who nodded and smiled at Rabbi's words. He could be right, they said. And one of the king's counselors, who was in the crowd, hurried off to tell the king what he had heard. And as the people argued back and forth, into the town rode the old king himself. "You will do as the lad commanded," he said. "Tomorrow you will treat this giant like a king. Sing to him, dance for him, and offer him gifts. Then bring him to me, and I will decide what is to become of him. Go now and make ready for a royal giant." And so the people hurried off to obey their king, and Rabbi returned to his home at the inn. In the morning, Rabbi awoke to the sound of bells ringing from the steeples. Out in the street, he saw flags flapping from the rooftops and ribbons streaming from the windows. "Here comes the giant!" called a boy who was sitting in the branches of an oak tree. Rabbi watched the giant as he pounded up the hill with his red face twisted into a tight knot of anger. Roaring and bellowing, the giant thundered through the streets. But today, the people stood in their doorways and bowed down as he passed them. "Hello, gracious giant," they cried. Soon, the giant's roars lowered to a muffled rumbling, and his heavy pounding slowed to a steady march. Clusters of children scampered into the treetops and showered him with blossoms. "Bless our gentle giant," they cried. "May his life be long and happy." Rabbi, who ran alongside the giant, saw his face crinkle now into a faint, shadowy smile. See him smiling?
Mm-hmm.
When they reached the town square, Rabbi bowed to the giant and said, "Rest now, gallant giant, rest and eat." So the giant sat beneath the shade of a sycamore tree, while the townspeople brought him jugs of milk, trays of fruit and honey, and platters of plump roast chickens. Then they brought out their fiddles and flutes, and they began to sing and dance. All through the day, as the sunbeams toppled through the leaves, Rabbi and the giant watched the people swirling and whirling in a great flurry of delight. "Do they really dance for me?" The giant turned to Rabbi, as his voice was deep and low like the rumble of a waterfall. "Oh yes," replied Rabbi, "it's all for you." And the giant's face crumpled into a wide, floppy smile. The afternoon shadows lengthened. The sun began to sink beneath the jagged peaks of Ben Colin, and in the purple glimmer of twilight, the children gathered around to sing their last song. A cradle song, soft and slow and sweet. Rabbi watched the giant's eyes flicker as he fell into a deep sleep. A cool breeze now ruffled the leaves, and a wee lass, seeing the giant begin to shiver, took off her coat and ran over to him. "Poor giant," she whispered. "See how cold he is?" And she tried to cover him with her coat. But of course, the coat was so tiny that it barely covered the giant's enormous hand. She called to her friends, and soon all of the children, and their mothers and fathers as well, were peeling off their coats and shawls. Tying them together, they made an enormous patchwork quilt, which they flung across the giant, covering his chest and shoulders. "Sleep now, gentle giant," said the child as she kissed his rough red cheek. "In the morning, we will bring you our gifts." As the children turned to leave, Rabbi wiped away a tear that trickled down the giant's face. Then he pressed his cheek against the giant's mouth and breathed in one long breath after another. Finally, he stood up and hurried home to his room at the inn. See, he's all covered in the village people's clothes. All night, Rabbi worked on his gift for the giant. By the light of the fire and candle, he carved and chiseled until his eyes stung, his fingers ached, and his heart throbbed. In the morning, he picked up his carving and hurried off to the town square. There sat the giant, surrounded by swarms of people, bringing their gifts of fruit and flowers and honey. "I too have a gift for you," Rabbi cried. The giant's eyes opened wide in wonder as he held Rabbi's carving. "This looks like me," he gasped. "And yet it cannot be, for this is a king sitting on a throne with a crown and a cape." Rabbi smiled. "But it is for you," he said, "for I carve not what is, but what can be." Then, clapping his hands, he shouted, "Quickly now, a crown for our giant king and a cape." Did he like his gift?
Yeah.
At once, the children gathered armfuls of bluebells and wove them into a circle. Then, scrambling into the treetop, they placed the purple crown on the giant's head. The women scooped up the patchwork quilts of coats and shawls, and they too clambered up the tree and draped it over the giant's shoulders. Laughing and shouting, all the people followed the giant as Rabbi led the procession to the king's castle. What do you think the king's going to say?
No, it's not gonna be good.
Oh, let's see. But at the gates of the castle, Rabbi stopped in alarm, for there stood the king with his whole army behind him, their sharp swords glinting in the sun. "Halt!" shouted the king. "How dare my own people treat this giant as if he were a king? I will punish them for their treachery." And he raised his arm as if to give the command to attack.
The king's the bad guy.
Let's see.
King is the bad guy. It seems like it.
But the giant flung himself before the king. "No," he bellowed. "You will have to slay me first before you lay a hand on these people. They are my friends, and they have loved me well." At once, the king cast down his sword and lay his hands on the giant's shoulder. "Arise now, noble giant," he said. "Indeed, you have proved that you can act like a king, for only a king would lay down his life for his own people. Now you must come and live here in our kingdom." And so it was that the giant came to live in the king's castle. And after some years, when the old king got very old, the people made the giant their king. Rabbi returned to his father's shop, where he continued to carve the finest figures in all the land. Now and then, a passing traveler would stop and ask him, "Aren't you the lad who made that giant into a king?" But Rabbi would only smile. "Oh no," he'd tell the stranger. "He was always a king. I only discovered what was hiding there in his heart all along." The end.
That was a good book.
Yeah, that was a good book.
Yeah.
And that was The Giant King, written by Kathleen T. Pellet.